Welcome to our look at target operating models. Our focus this morning is on a term that is finding a lot more currency in conversations, probably driven mostly by the increasing need for change. And that is, of course, our target operating model, or TOM. So let's take out the target for a moment and talk about operating models. They've been around for well over 100 years now. Basically, their function is to coordinate the efforts of people that have come together in an organization, be it 5, 10, 100, or 100,000 people. The more you divide up the labor that's required to deliver an output, the more you need to coordinate and integrate that labor. So if you have 100,000 people working in your company, their efforts need to be coordinated and pulled together. And for the last century, that has found itself primarily in what's called an operating model, and that defines key elements of the company right down to the contribution of each of the people in the company. I mean, probably one of the more value-added contributors is Frederick Winslow, who produced a lot of papers in the very early 20th century, primarily driven by the transition from more of a craft focus to a mass production. Instead of having one person make a pair of shoes, we have 50 people make a pair of shoes. By dividing up the contribution, dividing up the labor that's needed to make that. And this, at that time, had the huge impact of reducing the skills needed and the time needed, which of course made a huge contribution to productivity and the whole drive for mass production. That thinking, that understanding has continued over the years through many other excellent researchers and consultants. The Open Group have made excellent progress with their IT for IT in the last 5-7 years. Probably more focused on the deployment of technology than the more organizational-wide focus of an operating model. And indeed, IT for IT does get into a lot of architectural definition at the more detailed levels. One that we like in IVI is the bearing point one, because it lays out very clearly the components of an operating model, the lower bit being the how and the top bit being the what. And of course, the sequence here for any organization is that this is a top-down focus, because we start with what is the mission of the organization, and the components of the operating model cascade down from that and define the processes into the skills that are needed and the people that are needed and the supporting tools and technology. So for us, the concept of IVI, within IVI of an operating model is essential. It really defines the what and the how things get done, the work that gets done in the organization. But we add another component to it ourselves, because just because an organization can define what needs to get done and how it gets done doesn't determine how good they are at it. And that's where the concept of the capability of any of the processes, any of the people that are involved in it, becomes a variable. The higher that capability, the more effective that organization's contribution becomes. And so we talk about capability maturity. So the summary for us in terms of operating models is that they need to be comprehensive, but they also need to be communicatable. And that primarily means we avoid as much complexity as possible. Highly complex diagrams just don't compute and do not trigger the desire needed for the masses of people. It has to be top down, as I said. It must come from what does the company need to do. And this is becoming more and more important, because what the company are trying to do changes very rapidly, which of course triggers then changes in the operating model going forward. But it needs to be accurate also, probably not including the detailed procedures that perhaps are needed at the lower levels. Adding them into it just increases the complexity. So that's the operating model. Now, let's bring in the return to the word target. And that is becoming more important, because fundamentally there's so much change being introduced into organizational design and into the objectives of organizations. So the more that change requirement is focused on and understood, the more that has to be engineered, if you will, into the operating model, and therefore we have the term target operating model. So this is basically where we're trying to go and what we're trying to achieve. What's driving that change? Well, there isn't an organization in the world that probably isn't experiencing the demands and the necessities and the imperatives that are in what people call different things. We call it digital innovation. Maybe I have broken the key aspects of change into 7 components. Again, following the classical operating model scenario of beginning with the digital strategy. In other words, why is an organization changing at all? What are they trying to achieve? And probably dropping to the lowest level, where the foundation of that is, of course, the skills and competencies of the people in the organization that are delivering the output and the value add. So, in summary, 3 key points to focus on for the target operating model. Number one, it is your repository. It is your record of the day, capturing how is it that you do things, how is it you do work at any moment in time. And so as you make changes, they need to be recorded, and the organization needs to have a central point where people can go to reference how is it they do things, and also managing the interdependency, because as we change one area, we need to understand where does it have an impact on another element of the business. The second one is it's more than just how do we do things around here. It's also about how well we do things, right? So managing and measuring the capability maturity that exists is critically important. With the objective of not reaching the highest level, but of attaining a level that you are satisfied with, and also making sure that there's a balance across the different components of your business. The final point from IBI today really is to acknowledge the magnitude of digital innovation changes on the business. We believe it's a fundamentally different way of doing business, different from a model that's existed for the last 100 years, one more associated with command and control from the Taylorism and supporting writers' thinking down through the decades. Bringing in agile ways of working, empowering a workforce that are allowed to be and encouraged to be highly innovative, working in much greater levels of autonomy without that command and control, and being 100% focused on the customer and what the customer wants, and acknowledging that changing all the time, puts huge emphasis on change, and therefore the target operating model becomes a critical tool to channel and control the rate of change. Thanks everybody for listening. Hope you found that advantageous.